James is 30 years old and requests $90,000 of debt be discharged in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He has no assets other than his $30,000 Toyota Camry. After his divorce, he moved states and lost his job. He has been struggling for years to pay off his debts exceeding his annual income of $60,000. James is looking for a fresh financial start to begin living again. Will he get approved for Chapter 7 bankruptcy? Hey everybody! Welcome to the Build Young, Grow Wealthy podcast. My name is Walida Cherie. I help busy professionals and entrepreneurs manage, protect, and grow their income to obtain financial freedom. In today's podcast episode, we will be discussing bankruptcies, the terminology you need to understand, the pros and cons of filing, the eligibility requirements of Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, the process to file for each, 4 ways to avoid bankruptcy, and how to rebuild your credit once you are approved. If you like this kind of content and want to know every time I upload, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Disclaimer: this information is for educational purposes only. This is not legal advice. Please consult with a bankruptcy attorney for guidance on your specific situation. Without further ado, let's get into this. Bankruptcy is a way for honest yet unlucky people to get a fresh start on their finances. Otherwise, we would live in a society like Squid Game, where you would have to risk your life to pay off your debts. Bankruptcy is most commonly used for people whose debts exceed at least 25% or more of their annual income. This likely means that they've exhausted all options for paying down their debt, and this is their last resort to resolve their debt problem. Filing and getting approved for bankruptcy should be well thought out because it will stay on your credit report for 7 to 10 years, making it much harder to borrow money. It may also cause future employment issues and also lower your credit score. In past years, it was much easier to get approved for bankruptcy. However, consumers racked up debt and left their creditors at a loss. So, new legislation was introduced in 2005 to prevent this from happening so frequently. Today, it is more challenging to get approved for bankruptcy, depending on which state you live in. Before we discuss the 2 most common types of bankruptcy, which are Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, let's break down some terminology to help you understand what's being discussed. Terminology you need to understand. Number 1, whenever you hear automatic stay, any collections activity taken against you, such as a foreclosure, judgment, or wage garnishments, must temporarily cease. Number 2, a discharge is ultimately the main objective of filing a bankruptcy. This releases personal liability of debt from the debtor. Number 3, secured debt is a loan backed by collateral such as a mortgage and car loan. Number 4, unsecured debt has no collateral attached. However, you have a moral obligation to repay what was borrowed. This includes credit cards and medical bills. As a side note, unsecured debt is more favorable than secured debt when asking for debts to be discharged. Number 5. Now let's talk about dischargeable debts, meaning debts that, if discharged, you are no longer responsible for paying back. They include auto loans, medical bill debts, rent, credit card debt, and utility debt. Number 6. The last term is non-dischargeable debts, which means even if you get approved for a bankruptcy, you are still responsible for paying back the following debts: alimony, child support, student loan debt, taxes, and court-ordered damages. Hopefully, you understand the terminology because now we will dive into the pros and cons of filing. The pros. As mentioned previously, the pros of filing for bankruptcy are excellent because it gives you a fresh financial start. It can also help you see where you went wrong because you will have to work with an approved credit counselor to be eligible to file. The cons. Non-dischargeable debts such as alimony, child support, taxes, student loans, and court-ordered damages must still be paid. Unlike regular negative credit, which can stay on your credit report for up to 7 years, a bankruptcy will remain in your credit report for up to 10 years, affecting your credit score by a minimum of 200 points. Because you have defaulted on paying back your debt by filing for bankruptcy, it may make borrowing money more difficult for the 10 years after you file. If you appreciate a particular lifestyle or neighborhood, you might become restricted from getting approval. In order for you to stay, if you're not refused, then you may have to pay a larger deposit or need a co-signer. Expect your insurance premiums to increase. The rule of thumb is the better your credit score, the better premiums you'll be offered. Because your credit score will drop dramatically, you may pay more for the same insurance policies. Finding employment may become more difficult, especially if your career requires a license and needs to access your credit report. And lastly, your confidence might get challenged after realizing that you cannot pay back the debts you owed without having to make such a major sacrifice. Now let's move on to the eligibility requirements for Chapter 7 and 13, as well as the process to file for each. Chapter 7 is the most common form of bankruptcy. About 70% of people get approved for this chapter. It is also known as liquidation because although you aren't responsible for paying back the debts, you also don't get to keep all of your assets. So how do you qualify for Chapter 7? Number 1. Simply put, the more money you make, the less likely you'll be able to file for Chapter 7. You must earn less than the median income for your state in the last 6 months. They call this the passing the means test. Number 2, 6 months before you file for bankruptcy, you must get mandatory credit counseling from a court-approved nonprofit credit counselor. Be sure to get your certificate as your proof of attendance, otherwise, it will delay getting approved. The cost of credit counseling can range from free to $50. Number 3, once approved, you must complete an approved debt management course to get discharged from the bankruptcy. Next, we will transition into Chapter 13, also known as wage earner bankruptcy. How do you qualify for Chapter 13? Number 1. In Chapter 13, you must take the same means test used for Chapter 7 to determine your income. In this case, they're checking to see if your income exceeds your state's median. Number 2. Next, you must receive credit counseling with the same requirements as Chapter 7. Number 3. Lastly, just like Chapter 7, once approved, you must complete an approved debt management course to get discharged from the bankruptcy. The difference between Chapter 7 and 13 is that with Chapter 7, the debts are being discharged, and you usually have to give back your assets. But with Chapter 13, you can keep your assets, but you have to repay the debt usually over a 3 to 5 year time span. Any debt remaining after that will basically just go unpaid and you're not held accountable. Now let's talk about 4 ways to avoid bankruptcy. At the beginning of this episode, we discussed James in our case study wanting to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The fact is that James' finances took a big hit after getting a divorce and losing his job, which were both outside of his control. But let's say this wasn't the case and he simply lost control of paying back the debt he borrowed. What are ways that he could avoid filing for bankruptcy? Number 1, he can listen to my podcast episode on how to remove collection reports even if you are not a professional, to see how he could resolve his debts directly with his lenders. If this is something that interests you as well, the link will be in the description box. Number 2, he could have found ways to increase his income by either getting a new job, starting a side hustle, or selling items that he no longer uses. Number 3, he could buy my book, How to Manage on Any Income, to determine which expenses he can reduce, as well as to have an overall picture of what his finances look like. If you would like a copy of this book, the link will be in the description box. Number 4, he could subscribe to my email list for exclusive tips, my LinkedIn newsletter, Let's Talk Money, and subscribe to the Build Young Girl Wealthy podcast to learn how to manage, protect, and grow his income. Now we're going to move on to our last part of this episode, which is how to rebuild your credit once you're approved. It takes between 4 to 6 months from the time you file for bankruptcy to get approved for Chapter 7. Just so you know, Chapter 13 takes much, much longer. By now, James has completed his mandatory credit counseling as well as his debt management course. What should James now understand about how to rebuild his credit after getting approved for bankruptcy? Number 1, he should ask if he can reaffirm some of his debt. This means keeping a few lines of credit that he's in good standing with that he can afford to make monthly payments. This allows his older accounts to show some signs of his ability to pay back in the future because he's probably going to get denied for future credit opportunities. Number 2, apply for a secured credit card. This works like a regular credit card, except the account uses a deposit that guarantees your ability to pay. Be sure your institution will report your payments to the credit bureaus. Number 3, take out a credit builder loan and pay the fixed monthly payments every month. Number 4, lastly, learn from his mistakes. Really vet who he decides to marry and always look for ways to keep some type of cash flow in his bank account. So, do you think James made the right decision to file for bankruptcy, or do you think he should have exercised other options first? Be sure to leave me your comment. That's all I have for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with a friend. Until next time, I will talk to you later.